It's clear to all of us that ending drug-related deaths it's a national mission, it's a national responsibility. We all have a part to play in this. And yes, part of that is making sure we have the right services, that they're available, that they're accessible, and they are there for when people need them. But there's a wider question in my mind, and that is the question of how we think about drugs and the people who use them in our society. I think it's time that we took a step back and really asked ourselves some questions about that. One of the key influences to how we think about drugs and people who use them is the legal framework. And our framework is built on the Misuse of Drugs Act, which is now 50 years old. Things have changed a lot in 50 years. We've really shifted, I think, in our understanding and in the evidence that helps that understanding about what works to prevent harm, to reduce drug use, to prevent problematic use, and to prevent crime. I'm not sure that our legal framework reflects that learning, so I think it's time for us to be thinking about something new. And the evidence is mounting. Report after report after report is saying we need to think about a new approach. So to help push that conversation on, we wanted to share this film with you. And it's a film that shares the ideas of some people within TPS who have been working in this field for a long, long time and coming from different perspectives. They've got real ideas about what is working, what's not working, and what could work in the future. We hope that by sharing it with you, it will encourage you to ask yourself some questions and to get involved in this conversation, because it's a conversation we need to have.
Well, the law is important because what it does is it drives not just a response to the legal aspects, but it drives a culture. The 1971 Act that we're now talking about has driven a culture, but it's one that's punitive. It's one that apportions blame and consequence with a view to deter and try and control supply. We know from the facts, we know from the statistics that it's had a limited effect, but we also know that the prisons are bursting at the seams, and addiction forms a huge part of that criminal behaviour. So the time is right now to reconsider whether the 1971 Act is still delivering the results that are required with that experience and for the Scotland as it stands right now.
We need to be talking about the laws around drug use because they're preventing some of the things that are evidence-based and public health approach. So the law just now was set up at 1971 to tackle maybe a different thing for what we want to tackle just now. So we need to be talking about what that's preventing us doing. For example, evidence bases from around the world tells us that safer consumption facilities are something that reduces harm. They're a place where people can go and they can feel part of a community, they don't feel condemned for their drug use. And within these we know there's been no overdoses, and that would mean that the drug-related deaths in Scotland would reduce dramatically. We also know that we can work with individuals within them when they're injecting to get alongside them and show them how to inject, or to maybe just give them tips about how they're injecting, and that can make that practice much safer, which would mean that there won't be as much injecting related injuries. So although the law hasn't set out to get in the way of this, it has done. The law is stopping us from moving forward for where the evidence is. And another example of that is drug checking services. Drug checking services allow us to take some drugs from the individual and check the quality of that and the quantity of that. And why that's important is they're unregulated, so we don't know what the concentration of the drug is within that. We also don't know what's mixed in with that and the dangers that these things can cause. So we can tell the individual what's there and they can make that informed choice about the type of drug that they're using and the risks involved in that.
The legal framework as it stands right now actually causes harm and is unfit for purpose. In a justice system, it needs to be more responsive and based on a public health model in order to reduce offending. We know from experience that it doesn't work to punish people into recovery. Rather, people need access to good evidence-based education and information in order to make informed choices and to reduce the harm to themselves and to others. And our ability to offer this to people is really limited by the illicit nature of drugs and the stigma that surrounds them and the people that use them. This also presents a barrier to people seeking and accessing advice and support and treatment.
Our current legislation is not necessarily based on evidence. It's not based on the harm that's caused by individual drugs. So we have a classification system, and that classification system doesn't look at the harm of the drug. Actually, to understand why drugs are classified in certain ways is quite confusing. I think sometimes that maybe is a moralistic judgment that's maybe put about who in society was using which drugs at the time. And now I think we need to look at where the harm is. So let's classify things based on their own harm rather than on maybe a judgment of the type of people that are using that.
There's currently a distinction made in our legal framework that some drugs are okay but others are bad, which perpetrates the stigmatisation of the people who use the so-called bad drugs. The stigma around drug use drives drug-related harm by damaging personal relationships that can actually insulate people and further marginalising and excluding people from mainstream services. By driving self-stigma, which is where someone starts to believe the wider societal stigma around them, what we also see is an increase in a person's own belief that they're not worthy or deserving of support. Also, because drugs are illegal, people tend to engage with those involved in criminal behaviour, which in turn exposes themselves and others to the risk of violence, harm and other repercussions that can have long-lasting consequences when this could have been avoided.
So this tells me that this is an ideal time to now consider what the options would be for both a whole-scale change in the legislation, but also the things that we can act on right now in advance of whole-scale change.
Our aim is to prevent harm and minimise the impact that drug use has on individuals and families and communities.
We think it's really important that our legal system should be designed to help people get past problems in their lives and not trap them or restrict their progress and not add to the problems that they're already experiencing. I think the justice system can be designed to address the problems that lead to the crime. We know that people can and do recover from problematic drug use, so our laws should help us get to that point and not make it harder for them. And the quicker people can be supported to recover and get the help they need, the less harm will be done, and ultimately the less people will be involved in the criminal justice system. This always results in better outcomes for communities, less people in prison, and actually frees up the capacity for the police and other justice partners as well.
I think it's fair to say that this is an incredibly complex area. And the law is not, in its own right, the answer, the only part of the answer. But it is really important that it forms part of a general approach. And so what we need is to firstly accept that a change of law does not mean to say we're going soft on drug dealing. It doesn't mean to say it's open season on things that are effectively criminal behaviours. And we would want, with any replacement kind of legislation, to ensure that we've got a strong and robust an approach to those that would peddle harms that the individuals are doing just now for personal profit.
So, for example, we know that benzodiazepine is causing a lot of harm in Scotland. It was present in lots of drug-related deaths, different benzodiazepines, and we find that difficult as a challenge for us with treatment pathways. However, that is a lower classification than things like LSD. That they're maybe not causing as much harm and not as present as much in drug-related deaths.
But it is important that the law is intelligent and discerning in its outcomes. And the only way to do that is to make sure that it is carefully constructed and enables a kind of harm minimisation or a person-centred approach. Law in its essence is there to protect society, it's to protect people within the country. And it seems to me that the evidence from the 71 Act is increasingly demonstrating that those protections are not as effective as we might have originally hoped. I think ultimately, yes, is the answer to that. We do need new law. But we must also recognise that the law has got to reflect the values and the needs of the society at any one point in time. And you don't rush that kind of conclusion. So we need to accept that changing the law is going to take time. It's going to take consultation, and that's important. It's an important part of getting that right.
I think we do need a new framework. However, some of the barriers to creating a more person-centred, holistic approach to working with people effectively in the justice system are much wider than just the reform of the legal framework. I think what we need to do is continue to be involved in what is a much wider piece of work tackling stigma and prejudice. For too long, there's been almost a societal perception that people who experience problematic drug use are less worthy of the support than other people. The idea that punishing people, or what might be called the war on drugs, is the only way to get people to change and reform. The decriminalisation of drugs and almost the altering of the lens in which we view people suffering with problematic drug use to a more compassionate one, and our ability to offer the right support to people will hopefully go some way in at least changing the attitudes in communities and the wider public.
It's more than just the law, it's about society change, it's about stigma, it's about everybody coming together with understanding what the solutions are, rather than maybe being against a solution when they don't understand it. It's maybe about education, and it's about us providing the evidence to everyone so they can make informed decisions.
And obviously, with the scale of drug deaths in Scotland, we can't wait for the time it would take to construct new law and rely on that as an answer to the problem. We need to act now. And I think there's lots that can be done, and we've demonstrated can be done right now, that can be really important interim steps prior to new legislation coming through. Naloxone's a great example of that, and the progress that's been made around availability and access is really impressive.
So if we've had the political will before there is flexibility within the current legislation. We have had things from the Lord Advocate or within the law itself to allow things like provision of paraphernalia and injecting equipment. So we've done that within the current law. But however, we've maybe not been brave enough, or we've not had the will to move towards things like drug checking or drug consumption facilities. And I'm sure if we look at within that flexible law, there might be ways that we can look at implementing these things.
Unfortunately, there are often some what are unhelpful misconceptions around what decriminalisation means. Decriminalisation really aims to reach people whose crime is connected to their drug use. And rather than prosecution or punishment, an arrest becomes an opportunity to encourage people towards the support that they need to prevent further harm to themselves, to others, and to their community as well. The law around drug use or possession does not change at all. It's just that our response to someone breaking the law that changes. It really requires us to see people struggling to get out of a situation and realising the best way to help them break that cycle and reduce offending is to view them with a public health lens rather than overly punitive or purely punitive. I believe that this would be a much more effective use of the resources available to our criminal justice system to give us an understanding into someone's journey. Decriminalisation is not a tool to excuse someone's behaviour or the crime associated with it or remove accountability. Rather, it really acknowledges that what we're doing now isn't really working. It's actually making things worse, and there's a much better and almost smarter way to work with people in this situation.
I think the first thing to say is we can learn a lot from what happens in other countries, but I'm not convinced that there's any one model that is immediately transferable into Scotland. And even if there was, I think that rather misses the point. I think part of the real value and richness is the conversation that enables us to model the arrangements that are right for our circumstances. Decriminalisation is a hot topic, and people get quite emotionally charged when we talk about that, and often lurch to one end of that spectrum. And I think the real value is somewhere in the middle of that conversation. There can be no doubt there are some ends of the regulations that are getting in the way and stopping statutory services, the NHS and the voluntary sector from being able to render the kind of supports that are really necessary for people right now. Things like naloxone, things like drug testing and many others that effectively would fit into that spectrum of decriminalisation, but would not necessarily be what most people would think of when we enter into that discussion. So I guess what I'd be really interested in seeing is a good, rich conversation taking place.
I think we should consider everything. I think we should look at all the options that are available. We have a really serious situation on our hands with drug-related deaths, but also just with drug use in our society. We have high levels of drug use throughout society, not just individuals at really high risk. So what I think we should do is, we should look at decriminalisation. I think we should look at the evidence for that. However, if we look at countries that have introduced decriminalisation, countries like Portugal, this wasn't done in isolation. This was done with a whole range of other brave steps within a drug strategy. So it would be good to include that in a whole range of other things. Things like safer consumption facilities, drug checking services, services working better together in partnership, information sharing, and just a whole host of it. I think we need to stop looking for one solution to solve this issue and look at a range of different solutions and see how they come together.
I think what is needed now is bravery. I think what's required is that we need to keep the momentum that's already emerging and really drive it forward so that we've got an urgent response where it's possible to drive that urgency, but also take a longer term considered approach to things like appropriate replacement legislation. I think these things are not mutually exclusive. We can do all of that, but in order to do that, we do need energy, we need bravery, and we need determination. Certainly from our politicians, but also from anybody that has a leadership role in this space, and also as private citizens, to actually engage in this debate, to fuel and involve as many people as possible in reaching the right conclusions, I think is really important.
We need better understanding amongst everybody in society.
Yes.
You know, we need them to understand the issue and not be thinking maybe based on legislation that's out of date. You know, we've got a part to play in that as well. You know, about having that public conversation, even within our own family and friends, and also as an organisation and wider society. You know, it's about having that public discussion and allowing that healthy debate to look at all that from different angles, and maybe also to talk about the evidence base. I think sometimes we're a wee bit quiet about that as well. It's almost quite difficult. It feels it's difficult to talk about what we're doing because, you know, it's almost like there's stigma towards us as well. Sometimes it just seems a stigma around that whole issue. So let's try and break some of the cycles of stigma. And I think the campaign that's going run by the Scottish Government just now around recognising the signs of overdose. I was coming today and I heard that in my car, Martin Compton's voice coming through my car telling me to look out for the signs of overdose. Wow. You know, we need more of that. We need more of everybody taking responsibility. We need that shared responsibility as a society. This is our society and people are dying within our society.
It's okay to disagree. It's not a problem. In fact, often the solution can be enhanced by that disagreement if it's in a constructive kind of way or presented in a constructive way. All too often, though, that disagreement becomes a barrier and inhibits progress. And that has certainly been evident in drugs and addictions kind of discussion up until now. I'd really like people to engage in that constructive debate, of course offer a view, but don't allow those sort of hard-felt views inhibit progress. We can't afford not to act, and I think that would be my single most significant message.
For my own part, I work in policy. My job is to push for policy that works, that is effective, that is based on the evidence. So I can see the need for change. But beyond that, I'm a citizen of this country. I am a mother, I'm a daughter, I'm a wife, I'm a friend. And I would hope that should anyone that I love need support, that support would be available to them, and that stigma and prejudice would not be the things that stopped them getting what they needed. I want to live in a safe and flourishing Scotland, and I believe that we can spend the resources we have differently to get us there. I hope that what you've seen in this film will spark some ideas, spark some questions, and I hope that you will get involved in this conversation so that together we can really try and move this forward and build something that really works for all of us.